afternoon. Welcome to the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors Talk to Internal Audit. I hope you've got yourself a coffee and are now going to join me for a chat about how we might support each other through the key challenges that we're facing as part of the COVID-19 pandemic. Those of you that were with me last week may remember that I said I was going to bring an Earl Grey. I brought water last week, so here's my Earl Grey. I hope you've got it. The other thing to bear in mind is this is that any of you that know Yorkshire will perhaps be familiar with Betty's Coffee Shop. You probably need a mortgage to have a cup of coffee and a wonderful cream cake, but somebody bought me that for a Christmas present, so I always have my Earl Grey tea in that cup. I'm Liz Sandwith. I'm the Institute's Chief Professional Practice Advisor. For those of you that don't know, the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors UK and Ireland is the only professional body that is dedicated exclusively to training, supporting and representing internal auditors in UK and Ireland. We have approximately 10,000 members across all sectors of the economy and all parts of UK and Ireland. And the members of our institute are also members of a global network of in excess of 200,000 members in 170 countries, all working to the same international standards, code of ethics and core principles. So collectively, we are quite a powerful force of 200,000 members. Today, I want to talk about something that internal audit reflects a lot on, but depending on your organization, depending on your sector, may not have a lot of experience in dealing with, and that is fraud. And when we think about fraud, I want us to think today about fraud and theft. So I want to link the two together. I want to start by thinking about perhaps how you define fraud. I've got some stats that I think might be interesting, slightly alarming, but predominantly today, I want to think about fraud in the world of COVID-19, which is where we are at the moment, and some of the perhaps disappointing human beings' behavior in relation to capitalizing on the horrendous situation we find ourselves in at the moment. So some stats to begin with. Apparently, not my stats from the internet, 75,000 employees, 75% of employees steal from their employer once, at least once. The number who steal frequently is about 35,000. In 2016, employee fraud cost UK businesses over £40 million. So it's a fairly substantial issue in most organisations. The other interesting thing is that employee fraud is usually a reflection, I guess, of employees' dissatisfaction. So an employee is particularly unhappy about their circumstances within the organisation at a point of time. So let's think of that in relation to COVID-19, because some employees will be furloughed, some will be being made redundant or will have been made redundant, and perhaps left their organisation at a time when control was slightly weaker than it would normally be. So some of these perhaps opportunities that were seized may not come to light until a little later on, perhaps as we start to return to work, people start to go through processes, go through documentation and identify some of the challenges. I'm surprised that the issues around employee fraud are not linked as much to the values of the organisation and ethical behaviour as I would have expected. It is more about simply they're dissatisfied with the organisation and they have an opportunity to steal, commit fraud, whatever. I have an example of that. When I worked for a media company, when I was head of internal audit at a media company, we had an instance of a young man starting out on their career who stole a significant amount of money from the organization by tampering with an invoice, changing the bank account in effect, allowing the invoice to be processed, and the money went into their account. The purpose of the theft was to be able to buy an engagement ring for his girlfriend, so he told us. That theft, which came to light fairly rapidly, it wasn't the cleverest of frauds or theft, came to light fairly rapidly. He paid it back. The culture of the organization was that they prosecute employee theft, and therefore the police were involved. He was prosecuted. He served 6 months in prison. We notified his professional body. He started out on his accounting qualification. We notified his professional body, and they wouldn't take him back as a member subsequently. But that highlighted to us that we needed to be more rigorous in relation to the processes that we put in place prior to invoices being authorized for payment. Things like, change of bank account details. Could we create a program that would identify instances where a supplier, for example, had changed their bank account? So we put some of those in as part of our fraud prevention measures, having learnt from that incident. We recovered the money, the young gentleman paid it back, but nevertheless, it was a wake-up call. So we need to think about what we need to be doing from an internal audit perspective in our organizations in relation to how we make sure that we have the appropriate controls in place to mitigate the risk of fraud. And some of the things that we need to think about are just around, what are the key controls? Where are the most significant fraud risk areas within your organization? So is that purchase orders? Is it expenses? But also there's something here about culture as well within your organizations. I have worked with organizations where they have a very clear expenses policy that clearly states that if you don't have a voucher, if you don't have a receipt, you can't be paid. But then you find that perhaps the CEO submits a claim, doesn't have all the vouchers, but's paid. And that then cascades around the organization as a message that says, well, it's okay for him, but it's not okay for me. Therefore, people start to get dissatisfied. Remember what I said earlier about dissatisfaction is one of the key drivers in relation to employees committing fraud. So we need to think about that. Across the globe, every year, billions of dollars are lost to fraud and corruption. And that results in inefficiencies, aborted projects, financial challenges, organizational failures in some extent, and in some extreme cases, humanitarian disaster. So if you had fraud, financial irregularity, and we have seen this in the charities sector, then perhaps what would happen is that would cause concern to the public. Charities are fairly reliant on contributions from members of the public. Therefore, if their reputation is damaged, and you may remember there was a lot in the press about a charity called Kids Company some time ago and about the behavior at that point of the CEO, that impacts on donations, not just on the charity impacted, but on all charities, because the people, the members of the public who donate, start to doubt the rigor of the charity and therefore bring into question whether I should give my money to something that may not have the rigor in terms of ensuring that the money gets to the vulnerable people. So we need to factor that into our thinking. So now if we move forward a little bit and think about COVID-19 and some of the government protocols that have been put in place to try and protect organisations. And I'm thinking here around the employee retention programme. That went live on the 20th of April and covers organisations who've had to furlough employees. So a substantial amount of employees, perhaps in the leisure, hospitality, airline companies, those sorts of sectors, travel. One of the, I thought, interesting comments that came out and on the very day that the applications were submitted was the CEO of HMRC talking about 4 lines of defense that he had. The requirement of an employee to be authenticated by HMRC. So they will check that. Sorry, employer, not employee. There's a 4 to 6 day processing period to allow time for some checks. Checks are made to ensure that the payout for the claim is valid. But he also referenced as a 4th line of defense, whistleblowing. Now, as internal auditors, we're familiar with whistleblowing in our organizations, but had we thought about whistleblowing as perhaps a 4th line of defense in relation to fraud? And so I think it's worth thinking about that when we think about the processes and procedures we as internal audit need to put in place to make sure that we can protect our organization from fraud of whatever form. And don't always assume that these things are huge amounts of money. I can recall many years ago, not long after I first started working as internal audit in the financial services sector, there was a fraud at director level. A director had set up a company purporting to provide goods and services to the organization. He authorized the invoices for payment, and the bank account was his joint account with his wife. He lost his job and his career for, I think it was less than £16,000. So I think that the scale isn't necessarily an indicator of significant amount of fraud and risk to your organization. It's the opportunity and the culture within your organization. So I wanted us to think about things like fraud risk assessments. So as part of internal audit, what we should be looking at is where do we believe that fraud is most likely to occur in our organization? I'm quite strong in terms of it is not internal audit's job to find fraud. Absolutely clear on that. We may well find it, absolutely, when we're doing audits, when we're reviewing transactions, we may observe things happening that are inappropriate, but it is not our job to find fraud. And that needs to be in the charter that you submit to your audit committee for approval. So make it clear in there what your remit is in relation to fraud. But what it is our job to do is to assess the risk, the likelihood of fraud occurring within your organization and where that fraud might occur. Because undertaking audits in a particular area that you have identified as a high potential risk area for fraud means that at least you need to be aware of it. And you also need to ensure that management has put in the right controls that will detect and prevent fraud from occurring. And we will assess those controls. We will assess the rigor and the effectiveness of those controls, both in terms of design and operation. So that is definitely something that we need to be thinking about to make sure that it is working in our organizations. So I want us now to think about moving into the new world we're finding ourselves in, the COVID-19 world, and the challenges that presents to us. A lot of employees will be working from home across every sector you could imagine. And that means that often controls may be a little less than you would have expected. It may be that people working from home don't necessarily understand the importance of control in terms of the processes and the transactions that they are dealing with, as they would have done if they had sat in the office next to colleagues who are doing the same job, similar jobs, and they can sense check what they're doing with them. So what are the challenges that face us today? The Guardian on the 4th of April referenced more than 500 coronavirus related scams and 2,000 phishing scams or attempts by criminals seeking to exploit fear over the pandemic. And they've been reported to UK investigations. One of the things that made me smile was an example of a phishing email, and I'm sure you've probably heard it, where a member of staff in the finance team, I think it was a finance manager, had received an email purporting to come from their CEO saying they needed them to process and dispatch £30,000 as a matter of urgency, immediately in effect. And the finance manager looked at the email and started to think, oh my goodness, yes, I need to get on this. It's important. Look, it's the CEO. I don't want to get into trouble or lose my job, etc. And then he noticed at the bottom of the email, it said, thank you. And he knew that the CEO of their organization never said thank you. So he immediately doubted the veracity of the email, looked a bit further, dug a bit deeper, and didn't action it. So we need to keep that in mind as well, particularly at the moment because of everything that's going on. So we're on less stable ground. We have some real challenges around what's going on. In April, for example, 216 million records were breached, and that's potential identity theft. Identity theft can be the start of external to the organization, even internal to the organization, attempting fraud. So when you think of that scale of fraud, we need to think what that means in terms of controls and processes. So let's think about what we need to think about in terms of protocols that we need to have in place. So is your organization aware of the current emerging fraud risks? Is there something on your organization's intranet page somewhere that can highlight to all staff and make them therefore way more attentive to this, the number of frauds that are happening within their organizations? Can we provide assurance that current policies regarding potentially damaging attacks are constantly reinforced, particularly during this period of remote working? So do you have a protocol in your organization where if there has been a phishing email, that immediately there's a process that sends out to all staff a training protocol, a training requirement? Now that can be only 15 minutes. It doesn't have to be a major piece of work, but just to remind people, this is what came in and this is what you need to remember. And here's some reconfirmation of probably what you already know, but make sure you know it again with a little test at the end that they need to pass. Is that in place? I had to own up a couple of years ago because I was the one who selected an email that purported to come from a reputable newspaper in America that said that Hillary Clinton had been killed. It was around the time of the Trump-Clinton elections. And I thought, oh my goodness, and clicked on it. And that generated everyone in the organization having to redo the training because Elizabeth, I got my Sunday name then, Elizabeth clicked on it. So make sure we've got those sorts of things in process. Do we focus on the work of those monitoring suspicious reporting? So in our organizations, do we know as internal audit whether there are protocols for monitoring suspicious reporting to ensure that the appropriate level of alert is maintained? Do we provide a source of information in terms of the nature and examples of current attacks, frauds, thefts from organization? So do we as internal audit see what's going on external to our organization, find out what's happening in other organizations and report it in, make sure our organization doesn't fall under the same challenge that perhaps previous organizations have? And there's a really good example of this. I'm sure you will all remember the Patisserie Valerie instance that occurred where suddenly there was a black hole in their accounts. According to the press, their finance director had been behaving inappropriately, and the owner, Luke Johnson, invested some of his own personal money in it to try and save the organization at a time of real financial crisis. It didn't work. They had to sell the company. But what did we all do about that? Did we wonder whether our FD could be a potential Patisserie Valerie FD, behaving inappropriately, doing something that was inappropriate? I was talking to a head of internal audit not long after this broke, and he said to me, horrendous story. He said, as soon as I saw that, I thought to myself, could our FD be the same or similar FD to that? So he said, I went down to him. I sat with him over an hour, talking to him, understanding the challenges that being an FD in our organization presented. I talked to him about controls and processes and structure. And he said, I went back to the office. I looked at the last couple of audits we'd done in the finance area. We'd done an expenses one, and we had done an accounts payable one. And he said, I had a look through there. I had a look at the control environment, the ability to manage risk, all of those sorts of things, and came to the conclusion that it was extremely unlikely that we were going to be the next Patisserie Valerie. So I put together a relatively short email with the caveat, of course, as internal audit does, we can provide you with reasonable assurance. And I told the CEO and the chair of the audit committee in this email what I had done. And they were really delighted to hear that, and pleased that I had taken that step. This is what this head of internal audit had said to me. And therefore, that said to me, as Chief Professional Practice Advisor at the Institute, that we need to think outside our box. We need to look and see what some of the challenges are that other organizations face, and then assess our organization to see whether the same thing could occur to us. So I want you to bear all these sorts of things in mind. I want us also to think about supporting the business in any way we possibly can in terms of mitigating the risk of fraud. And there are some very basic issues here. You know, are our employees appropriately supervised? Do we use purchase orders? Or suddenly does an invoice come in because somebody's had a conversation on the phone, ordered something, and the next thing we know is an invoice? I'm really quite a geek, if you like, in relation to purchase orders, because for me, the purchase order is the key control. And we ought to have protocols around who can raise purchase orders, how they are signed off, because I believe that once a purchase order has been approved and signed off in accordance with delegated authority, the invoice, when it comes in, is less of a problem because you've already committed to the purchase. No purchase order means that invoices can be misstated. You can find you get an invoice for more than you anticipated, purely and simply because you didn't raise a purchase order. Do we have protocols for controlling cash receipts? And is internal audit occasionally used as a deterrent control? I know we talk a lot about we're here to help you, we're a trusted advisor, all of that absolutely is what we're about. But sometimes employees knowing that their organization has an internal audit function, and that internal audit function audits processes and procedures, is a really good control. So my sort of closing thoughts on this are, now we're working remotely, perhaps we have time to have a look at some of our policies and procedures across the organization, particularly in areas that we have identified as high fraud risk areas, and make sure that they are sufficiently rigorous in terms of ensuring appropriate behaviours and reducing the opportunity for fraud. The other thing I would say is I worked with a CEO, and I can remember having a very lengthy conversation with him about culture across the organisation, the importance of governance, risk management, and all of this. And after I'd been talking for about 15 minutes, he said to me, "Do you know what, Liz?" He said, "You're just making it too complicated." And I sort of went, "Oh, am I?" He said, "Yes." He said, "It's as simple as A, B, C." And I looked at him and he said, attitude across the organization, behavior of all people within the organization. C, consequences. People know if they behave inappropriately in their organizations that there are consequences attached to that. He said in his experience, too often we had the attitude and the behavior, but the consequences was missing. So those are my thoughts for today. What I need to just tell you as I leave you to enjoy the long weekend, although I think in Leeds they're forecasting frost again and maybe some snow on Sunday. Anyway, let's wait and see. The live stream is available afterwards for friends, colleagues, family. Maybe your son, daughter, partner would like to watch a Facebook session on fraud, who may have missed the live version on the Institute's Facebook channel. You can also follow all of the really exciting things the Institute is doing on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And you can access on our website our Audit and Risk magazine, which is now available to members electronically. You don't get it through the post anymore, you get it electronically. And I'm happy to take questions. Those of you that know me know that, if you drop me an email, I will always answer questions. I hope you'll join me next week, because I want to look then at business resilience and crisis management. Don't forget your coffee. And just to wind up, please can I say, talk to Internal Audit, because the Institute is listening. Have a great day, stay safe, and enjoy the weekend. Thank you very much.